Welcome to another episode of The Backstage Creative, the podcast that focuses on the people who work behind the scenes of theater. My name is Krista Copper. I started this podcast about 2.5 years ago for many reasons. And one of the main reasons was that I realized the benefit of talking to people who did different jobs than myself in the theater world. As a musician, I realized I don't really know what all these people do and what their role in the theater and putting up a production is. And as I got to know more and more people in the industry, I found that I got better at my job once I had more understanding of everyone else's role. I think it's also really helpful just to know some of the challenges that people face in different roles in a production. And theater is so collaborative, and I think the more that you know, the more you can empathize with the people around you, the more patience you can have when there's a group of people trying to solve a problem and you're just sitting there in tech week in a tech rehearsal. I think it's so important for us to listen to one another and to deepen our understanding of what other people are trying to accomplish with the art that they create. With that in mind, today is my conversation with Tara Houston. Tara is a Louisiana-based scenic designer and painter. Tara teaches at a big university, and so we spend a lot of time talking about academia in this conversation. I'm so grateful that Tara was willing just to go places in this conversation and to dive deep into topics and share her experience working in academia, some of the issues that brings, and some of the ways that theater education could be better. If you like the Backstage Creative, feel free to follow the podcast on Facebook. I have a Backstage Creative podcast page on Facebook. You can follow me on Instagram, Krista Copper, Krista.Copper, both with Ks. Or you could reach out to me. I'd love to hear from people. I also really like to get recommendations. So if you know someone who you think would be an interesting guest on the show, or if you think you would be a good fit to be a guest on the show, feel free to reach out to me. I'd love to hear recommendations from people. All right, here's my conversation with Tara Houston. Are you currently working on any projects? Kind of what's going on in your life right now?
Yeah, I'm a full-time college professor. I teach scenic design at Louisiana State University. So I'm currently on probably the most break-like summer break of my life. So that's been, like a weird COVID gift. And I am working on one project. There's a production of a new show called Carmelo Full of Wishes, which is being produced at the Rose Theater in Nebraska, and it'll be opening in January of next year. So I'm in early talks for that, but otherwise I'm having a pretty chill summer, which is really nice. Welcome.
Do you usually teach classes during the summer, or is that just during the school year?
Usually just during the school year. Last year I taught classes so that students could have financial aid, knowing that most of them would not be able to find work. So I taught a class last summer, which is actually the first time I've ever taught a summer class. But typically I'm doing, shows or prepping for shows or that sort of thing in the summer. So a little quieter in my freelance life right now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm sure.
Like
For most,
everybody, I
yeah.
think.
Yep. What are some of the classes that you teach?
Yeah, I teach the scenic design classes both for undergraduates and our graduate program. I also teach drafting, both hand drafting and computer drafting. And then I teach our paint classes as well. So we have a track of paint classes that students can go through. And then other than that, there are some every now and then kinds of classes. I did a computer techniques class last year where we did some Photoshop and Affinity photo work, and then also did tablet rendering using Procreate. So that one comes along every few years. And then there's some other scattered classes, like some advanced drafting where we go in more into like 3D drafting and that sort of thing that's on a rotation. But most of the kind of like scene design related and paint classes that are taught at LSU.
How has working with young painters, young artists, young designers helped you in your designs and the art that you do?
Holy moly. I, that it sounds so cliched because you hear this all the time, but you actually have to know how to do a thing when you teach it to someone else. And there is something about also, I think, the repetition of teaching. Next year will be my 8th year of teaching in university. So, like, I've gone through these classes a lot now. And what it does is it forces you to really look at the essentials of what you're doing, right? And that's everything from like, how do you really paint an effective wood grain to like, how do you come up with concepts for shows that are dynamic and important and responsive to the script? And by repeating those lessons to students over and over again, I'm constantly interrogating my process and interrogating what works and what doesn't. And I feel really fortunate to work mostly with smaller groups, like most design tech faculty do. So we get a chance to kind of get in there and ask questions and have discussions about how our work lives in the world, right? Like, paint doesn't exist separate from the design, doesn't exist separately from the lighting in the show. So that chance to constantly check in about what's important to me about process and have students interrogate process in general and then how their work fits within it. It's just such a good constant reminder of why I do the work that I do.
Hmm. Yeah, I think getting back to the basics, I think can be so helpful. Yeah, in like a artistic process.
Yeah, absolutely.
Hmm.
Absolutely.
Hmm. So I'm a musician, and at least in like music world, professorships are pretty competitive. A lot of people want the prestige of working at a college, or the stability of a tenureship position. But I think so. I don't think those roles are suited for everyone. Like I don't think everyone's goal should be working at a college. Like I don't think it should be everyone's goal to work on Broadway. Maybe what are some of the realities of working at a university and having a heavy teaching load that maybe people who are desiring a professor position may not realize?
Yeah, I think I'm going to assume for a lot of people, and I'll speak for myself, I think the grass is always greener, right? Like there are
Yeah.
times where I wake up and I'm like, dude, oh, if I could freelance, I wouldn't have to go to this committee meeting or I wouldn't have to do this thing or that thing. So I assume other folks probably feel the same. What I will say is the great benefits of teaching are the stability that you mentioned, right? But if you don't have a passion for working with young artists, which requires an immense amount of patience and grace, like if you don't have that wired into you, I don't think teaching is for you. And the grace has to extend both to yourself because I often find myself in a place of, we'll call it failure, but really like, cool, that didn't work at all,
Uh-huh.
failures. And then also these incredible moments of like, oh, everything worked out and look at this is magical. But I think there's a lot more of space in between the failure and the magic. And if you can't be okay with that gray line of like, I'm going to go through an entire semester with 2 students that are actually engaged in this class, and the rest of the classroom's like coming along for the ride. It takes a lot of, I think, belief that the work that you're doing is valuable, whether the students are engaged in the moment or not. And I mean, maybe that's like part of being in the arts too, right? That we have to believe that the work we're doing is valuable, or why would we do it? But there is a certain amount of grind in the tenure track that is just a reality, right? That I am constantly questioning whether the work that I am doing is good enough to lead to tenure, whether I should say yes to this or no to that, and what it all becomes this calculation. And I've really had to take in the last couple of years some stock of the work that I want to do as an artist versus the work I think my institution wants of me, and trying to find some kind of balance between my aspirations for my career and my university's aspirations for my career, and then some unknown group of people committee that will decide whether I keep my job in the future or not. So I'd say there's an immense amount of like self-doubt that gets cooked into the system that in many ways benefits the institution, right? That you often will become a professor because you're a really great student. And being a really great student means you like to get A's on things. You want to excel and do well. And that also is marked by, the perfectionism that is so common in our industry. So like good students can become good professors, but they can also take on way too much because they're trying to make this perfect grade. So there's some like self-destruction that can be built into the tenure track trap. And I think, not think, I've talked to a lot of colleagues who have gone through this. So it's not unusual that I'm now in a place of trying to question what I want the trajectory of my career to be rather than what I'm trying to play out for some kind of institutional metric.
Hmm. That's good. Um, yeah, that's really insightful. And this is a huge question. So hopefully, I really like asking big questions. But how do you think colleges, over like very generally speaking, how do you think colleges could be better about teaching theater?
Yeah, I think some of it comes into this assumption that a great practitioner equals a great educator.
Mm,
And I'm not sure that that's always true. I have learned from really great practitioners, but often by modeling their practice and not necessarily because they are skilled educators. And we have come to a place in the arts where we believe the exceptional performer, the exceptional artist can be, by virtue of being so great, an exceptional teacher. I'm not sure that that's always true. So I spend I've used the word interrogate a lot. That's probably my favorite word as a teacher. But I've spent a lot of time really wondering what the purpose of higher education is. Like what is my job as an educator? What do I expect of my students in my classroom? And that all has to kind of be wrapped around this idea of what do we want the future of our industry to be? Because my grand plan, my grand hope is that the students that I teach in my classrooms will go on to be patrons of the arts, buy their tickets regularly, or somehow, be a part of our arts landscape. So some of that has to be visioning work. We have to be able to imagine what the future will look like. And if all of your creative energy is wrapped around your practice, I don't know that you have enough creative energy left to imagine what the future should be too. And that's not like exclusive. I don't think that's true of everyone, but I do think we have a limited amount of energy that we can devote to work, both our own like personal projects and also like our work within the industry. And then we add students into that work as well. It all becomes this like massive juggling act of where can I put this energy and make sure that I'm taking care of all of the various stakeholders I've made promises to. And I think it takes a very special kind of personality to say, today is not the day that I work on my art because I have a student in need or they have a project in need. And that means that I can't take front seat. And that for me is maybe the place where I've been, looking, and this all kind of ties back into that tenure track race as well, trying to think about what does it mean to be a community-based artist in a field that privileges those who are willing to work outside of their own community, right? Like I am most benefited by doing work that is not tied to my university, that is not tied to the state that I live in. I'm most privileged if I go further away. So, what does that mean for someone like me that believes the heart of theater and the heart of performance and the heart of art is about building communities?
hmm.
So, I think that for me is like the big tension in higher ed is that we talk about community, we talk about working with our students, we talk about building, some kind of a world together, but we're so privileged for working outside of our communities.
Oh my goodness. Yes, I see that. So I live in Kansas City, and a lot of times, yeah, they'll bring, these theaters and opera companies will bring in, outside talent, and they make like a big deal, like, oh, this artist from New York City, or, oh, this actor from, worked on an off Broadway show or something. And it's like, well, why don't we tout, people who are in this area? Like they're good too. Yeah. But yeah, that's a weird tension.
Yeah, yeah, I agree. And
Hmm.
like we grew these artists, right? Like shouldn't we be most proud of the artists we grew here at home?
Hmm. Yeah. And seek to support them and give them opportunities so that they can make a living in this community. Yeah.
Exactly. And not have to live elsewhere in order to work at home
Yeah.
or, live somewhere else. Like that whole like New York thing is really common in theater. Like, well, I spent 10 years working in New York, so now I'm good enough to come back home and make a living wage.
Hmm.
Yeah, infinite tension.
Yeah. It's so weird. The more you think about it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you ever feel, I don't know if guilt is the right word, of choosing one thing over the other? like students versus your own career, or choosing your own career, for a month at a time or something over students?
Yeah, totally. I think back to the year before all the shutdowns, and I had an incredibly productive year. And there came a pinch point. The school was opening two shows in November, and I was opening two shows in November that were outside of school. So I had one show that was in Florida and one show that was in Dallas, and I am in Baton Rouge. So it was like planes and travel and Zoom calls pre-pandemic. So we were all really bad at it, and trying to teach my classes and do notes on my shows and be an active and good collaborator. And really at the end of the day, I was just so tired, so tired that I'm not sure I was really doing anything well. And that was, kind of for me a breaking point of looking at priorities, that I couldn't actually, the idea, a friend of mine told me this a long time ago, you can't actually have multiple priorities. You can only put one thing first at a time. So the more you consider or try and juggle multiple priorities at once, the less energy you have to give anything your actual attention. And it was in that moment of like, from like the end of October to the end of November, I was in tech for 7 weeks
Wow.
continuously, right?
Yikes.
So like I was useless. I was like scraping by. My classes were barely happening. My, students were not getting the responses that they need on the productions that they were working on. I wasn't supporting them well. So all of that is to say that our industry really lies to us and says that we can work on multiple projects at a time, and capitalism necessitates often that we are working on multiple projects at a time. But in reality, we can only have a finite number of things that are important to us. And what happens when you suddenly have this like explosion of work or explosion of mentoring for students or explosion in a classroom where all of a sudden you're like trying to figure out how to restructure things? What's not helping, not happening at that point is self care, right? You're not cooking for yourself anymore. You're eating takeout or going through drive throughs. You're not taking care of your bodies, right? Like not drinking enough water, not sleeping enough, not exercising, all of those things that I know that we all know are essential to keeping us going. Those are the first things to get tossed aside. So at what point do you like grapple with capitalism and
Mhm.
grapple with expectations from your students and realize like you can choose to feel like a failure all the time, or you can start to clear the decks? Because I think that sense of guilt and failure walk so closely together in times that we expect so much of ourselves. And there is this expectation that teachers are meant to be perfect, that teachers are meant to be experts about whatever they might be teaching about. And how do we like let go of that a little bit to be human in our classrooms and human with our students? And that has to come from a place of like strong self-care and motivation and time and patience with ourselves.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, that's so true. Do you have kind of like a checklist that helps you decide how to pick a project? How do you go about picking and accepting, agreeing to different projects?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say in the year before the pandemic, I was doing, like a scatter approach. Like, I'm going to try all of these different places and try and see if I can find a place that feels like home. One of the challenges that I've had as an educator is that the first place I taught had such a huge teaching load, teaching 4 classes per semester and designing 6 shows a year for them. There was no room to do outside design work. So my freelance career basically dried up in the 3 years that I taught at that institution. So coming to LSU and having fewer responsibilities has meant that I have more time to look for projects. But it also means that, in my early 40s, as an artist who's been working in theater for 20 years, I'm trying to figure out how to start over again, but also from a place of finding it really essential to me that I work for places that treat their employees well, that believe in days off for their technicians during tech, that believe it is more important to take care of a person than have a bigger, brighter, fancier show. And trying to live in a place of values in an industry that I don't think is quite ready to match my values all the time. So it's been a weird dance the last couple of years of trying to find places that can feel like home, because I have found that that to me is more important than the scale of theater I might be working for or the scale of project I might be designing. That I am really happy in spaces that are collaborative, and that is not always true in the larger institutions I work for. They're the ones that are fancier and shinier and look better on the tenure paperwork, but I don't get the same kind of artistic satisfaction in working with a company that is more driven by profit than it is by care. So that's been what I've been trying to center in my work, is this idea of community building and this idea of collaborative work and these ideas around how we care for one another in a field that really disadvantages care, that has glamorized overwork, that has glamorized long hours, that has glamorized the starving artist mentality. So how do I find those companies whose values align with mine, so that I'm not constantly in conflict with the work that I'm doing and the people I work with?
What types of questions do you ask to find out those answers to that when you're initially talking to a theater?
Yeah, I ask a lot of questions early on about, like the nitty gritty that everyone can cover, budget and deadlines. Having worked as a paint charge for a number of years, I'm pretty good at diagnosing when expectations that maybe don't match budget lines or staffing. So that for me is like the first starting point. When I hear theater say, "Oh, well, we only hire in, painters part time," or "We don't keep a props master on staff. We only hire them in per show." And only if we need it, that you can find these kinds of tells within the conversation that says, either the theater has not prioritized the comprehensive sort of support that you need for a design to come to fruition, or that they're not paying their employees in a way that is sustainable. Meaning, if you're only hiring people in part time, what are they doing the rest of the year? And particularly when these are theaters in smaller areas, where they might not have the same kind of freelance pool that is different, say, in Dallas than it might be in a smaller town in Florida. That in Dallas, there is a group of freelancers that can be hired in part time and still have a sustainable life, but maybe in a rural area that's not necessarily as true. So trying to find the kind of information about what staffing looks like and budgets look like. And I just bluntly ask questions about, what kind of overtime do your employees work? Would you rather cut a show and simplify it, or would you rather bring in extra talent? How do you manage when those kinds of expectations for a show don't match up with the staffing that you have on hand, and kind of approach it from that place. A new place that I think a lot of us as artists are looking into is what the diversity landscape and inclusion landscape of a theater might look like. What is your, I do a lot of research now into who is working in shops, who is working in administration, and just trying to suss out, is this a predominantly white theater, or is this a monolithically white theater? And is this an environment that I think is the kind of place, again, that I want to work? Is this a place that's going to feel like home?
Hmm. Yeah, those are good things to think about. What have you found out about like asking for more, like more time, more money, more staff? Have you found anything to be effective when like you want to take the project but maybe the pay isn't quite right, or you're like, well, we need some more help on this. What have you found to be helpful with that?
Yeah, I think a lot of times early in my career, I worked more from a place of emotional appeal, which has not proven to be as successful as I would like it to be. It's like, this just doesn't feel right. It has never been a successful argument that I've had with a production manager. Um, but again, like I can tap into those experiences I've had working as a paint church in a regional theater for a number of years, working in summer stock for a long time, looking at the difference one more human body who has talent in a room can make towards changing and shifting morale, changing and shifting what you're able to accomplish. So for me, it's largely strategic around numbers and deadlines, because I think that is the language right now that is most effective with management. So that's the language that I am using. It is not as easy to talk from a place of harm reduction, which is really what we're talking about, right? That like bringing in more people for a project that is larger means the folks that work there full time will not be as drawn out, will not be working as hard, will be able to care for themselves and their families if they have them in a more responsible kind of way. Like we're talking about harm reduction for the people that work there full time by bringing in additional staff when needed. But that's not a conversation so far that has been manageable for me in negotiating contracts or negotiating whether projects are going to be right or not. So I think that that's a place that if I am going to take a project like that I think might be understaffed or might be undersupported in financially or whatever, I will go into it knowing I'm going to design smaller, tighter, smarter, knowing that I can try and do some harm reduction and mitigation in designing a smaller project.
That's really clever. I think you're, let me see. I interviewed someone who lives and works in Arkansas, but I think you're maybe the first I think I've interviewed some people who work in Florida, but I'm thinking like southern states, people who I've talked to live in the southern states. What is the theater scene like, in like the deep south of the states?
I think that it is a little more conservative. It is a little smaller, which often means that the communities are a little more intertwined. I would say incestuous, but I think that's kind of gross to say about people, but you know what I mean.
Uh-huh.
So I've done a majority of my work in the Deep South. So coming out of graduate school, I worked at the Denver Center for a year post 2008 recession where they were downsizing. So I was downsized out of a job and moved to Alabama and worked as the assistant charge and then eventually the charge artist at Alabama Shakes, and did some freelance work while I was in Montgomery, and then moved to Texas, lived there for a while, and now I'm in Louisiana. So most of my professional career has been in the Deep South. And what I find are kind of like magnified versions of what we hear about the arts landscape across the United States. One being that there's not a lot of funding going to the arts in the South. It is not typically a governmental priority. Often, arts institutions, like the arts councils and things like that are meant to support the arts in town are not as excited about the performing arts. So I think a lot of times theater and performance in general kind of slips through cracks in funding. Large institutions rely heavily on grants from predominantly white granting institutions, including our federal government, but also when we're looking at other arts institutions, they're predominantly white. So you see a lot of priority for funding for white theaters or theaters that produce more white friendly shows. And what we see is just like a complete drop off in funding for theaters of color and theaters that produce more diverse plays and playwrights. So I think that exists across our nation, right? It's no surprise that theaters of color are not funded as well as predominantly white institutions, but it's actually, in my opinion, expanded in the South in parts because living in Montgomery, Alabama, there was actually at the time I was there 51% Black and African American folks, and then the other 49% were a mixture of Asian, white, and Latinx folks. But the theater that I was working for predominantly was doing the one Black show a year kind of action. And we were seeing some more diverse castings in places, but it's again bringing folks of color into shows written by white folks. And are we really representing a community? Are people really getting to express their truths on stage, which is what we're supposed to be about here? So there is an interesting tension, I think, in how funding influences what's on stage. And I think a real challenge for theaters of color in the South to find enough equitable funding and enough ticket sales in order to have the stability of their own spaces, to have staffs that are able to support the work that they're doing, to the visioning that they are able to do. And I don't want to come at this from this sense of like scarcity that, everybody's resource starved and things are terrible, because I have seen such incredible work from theaters in the South. And I believe in it enough that I still live in the South. I'm still, training students that will work primarily in the South. And I believe that I hope that we are in a tipping place now where we are looking at funding structures, that we are looking at the kinds of voices that we're prioritizing. And I do hope that we can kind of build on those successes, like seeing the number of folks that turned out to vote in Georgia, despite the huge amount of voter suppression that is in place in that state, gives me hope. Seeing the numbers and demographics of voter shift in Texas gives me hope that there is a chance here to kind of break through some of these walls that have been built in the last 40 years that has separated communities from the funding they need to do work that is meaningful. So I think the work that is happening at the grassroots that is very community based and really tied to community is so strong here, and I believe so strongly in the voices that I have met telling stories here in the South, that I just hope funders can get to a place where they realize how precious this resource is and not try and mess it up when they come in to give dollars. I hope that we're in a place where we are learning the value of the voices in our communities and finding better ways to support them.
It's so dangerous to operate out of this scarcity mindset. Like, okay, if we give more over here, then there's less over here. And I mean, on paper, that's how it looks. But I really think like there is enough for everyone. And
Yeah.
I think if it's the hoarding, like right, I just had the mental picture of what happened when COVID struck and everyone freaked out and went and bought toilet paper. Like there's
Yeah.
enough for everyone if we don't just hoard it all to ourselves. And so yeah, I think the theater industry has a lot of work to do in hoarding.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and I think an interesting thing that I'm seeing in the last few years is this residency thing where, like, a large, predominantly white institution gets grant money to have a residency for a theater of color or for a, affinity theater, LGBTQ plus theater or something in their home. But what you're doing is you're like providing this sudden influx of support and funding. And then what happens when that 3-year residency is over? And like, what are the sustainable ways that predominantly white institutions can support and foster the growth of affinity theaters in their community without having to like own that product? And that's a model I'd be really interested in seeing how we can evolve that, and even within institutions of higher learning, I'm really interested to see how community-based projects could be more effective. So it is not just my predominantly white institution going into a neighborhood of color and saying, we want to do some work with you. Here are the ways that we can do it, rather than going into a community and saying, like, how can we support work that's already happening here? And I am interested to see if maybe that's a model that could be more sustainable. Just thinking about the privilege my institution has, the privilege that I have as a teacher at a nationally known theater program, like, how do I use that influence? How do I use that privilege in a way that isn't shaping the work but supporting work in our communities?
Mm. Yeah, that's a really important distinction.
Yeah, because we really know how to colonize, right?
Yeah.
Like, that is a mode in this country that we get, where we're like, you got cool things. I want to come see what your cool things are. And then all of a sudden, those cool things have become mine. And like, how do we shift out of this sense of like arts colonizing, where we go in and shape a community because of the work we want to do, rather than supporting the amazing work that is happening in communities across this country?
Mm. Yeah. Gosh, that's so important.
And hard. It's so hard because we don't have those tools yet.
Yeah. Yeah, our default is colonization because that's how we've been raised.
Yeah, it's the worst model, but the only one we got.
Yeah.
So I think about, like, I don't know if you're familiar with Urban Bushwomen, but it
Mm-mm.
is a group in New York, and they do a lot of community based work that is exactly what I'm talking about, where they go in with musicians and dancers, and really like infrastructure, right? So, like, here's our infrastructure. We want to do some work with this community, but what we're doing here is not bringing our work to this community. We're heightening the work that's already in the community. I'm like looking for models like that are more collaborative, with communities, that privilege the people that are in that space and provide resources they may not have had access to. And what we know about grants funding is grants are awarded to people who have successfully been awarded grants previously.
Yeah.
So how do we use, right, like the great catch 22 of grants funding? So how do we use our institutional privilege to support that work in communities that have not had access to that kind of funding before? Can we have micro grants? that then allow that company or arts community to apply for bigger grants so that they can start to fund their own work in ways that wasn't accessible before. And that's not me telling you what the work is. It's me telling you how to access resources you have not been able to attain before.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Very, very important. In your time working in theater, have you seen any big changes either in the industry, in the area that you're working, in the way theater's taught? Any changes that you've noticed since you started years ago?
Yeah, I would say there's a few. I'll start with education because that's I think where my heart is largely. I'm seeing a move away from this idea of the professor on a pedestal, that the professor is all knowing and has the plan for you and you just do what they say and move along. That I think in my education, I'm not going to say it was like a sense of a cookie cutter, like all of us came out with the same strengths because we were different humans when we came into the program. We were different humans when we left the program. But there was a certain one size fits all approach to education in the time that I was going to school, which was like late 90s, early 2000s. And I think the work that I have done in my classroom has been more about how do we approach the work in ways that individuals with different needs for their learning can still be supported, that can be supported, that we're all working towards this idea of how to better communicate. Because at the end of the day, in my opinion, that's what a scenic designer does. We're communicators. Sometimes it's visual, sometimes it's written, sometimes it's verbal. But at the end of the day, I just want to help you tell your story better. So what that means is everybody's got a different voice in their storytelling, and I want to make sure I'm supporting that work. Not that you're telling stories the way I tell stories, but I'm doing my best to support you to access the best storytelling tools that you have available and help you understand how to keep honing those once you're not in my classroom anymore, once you're not in a classroom anymore, so that we can encourage this idea of learning through experimentation, even when the stakes feel really high, which they are when you're like, I just need to pay my rent next month. Those are very high stakes. So how do we model those kinds of stakes in our classrooms in ways that still leave room for mistakes? And that wasn't really the environment that I was trained in. That wasn't the environment that I grew up in. So it has been a lot of reading and learning and experimenting and asking my students to be collaborators in the classroom with me as we tried different things. And that was never anything that happened early in my career or in the classrooms that I was part of. So that I think for me has been a major shift in seeing so many colleagues of mine across the United States embrace this idea of, one size fits all education is a myth. How can we be more accessible? How can we make sure we're supporting students with different learning needs? And how can we also help students imagine that you can have a satisfying career at a multitude of different levels in this industry, right? That not everyone is going to go to Broadway, and that's not a failure, that's a reality. And there is a beauty to working in different kinds of theaters. Like we can't always have one expectation for how this is all meant to work. So trying to find ways to be flexible in that education has been super important to me. And I've been really inspired by colleagues of mine who are doing that work too. So hopefully we're moving more towards equitable spaces in our classrooms and places where students feel empowered and in control about how they're approaching their education, and trying to find ways to make sure that we're supporting that throughout. So I think the industry, in my experience, is like behind my classroom in some ways, in that we have very much a one size fits all way of doing our work. It has become less collaborative in my time. Oh, and this is generalizing, but we have fewer meetings, they're done remotely. We have less time to have conversations as groups about the work that we are doing and what's important to us. That there's been a sort of separation of how we talk about design and the work that we are doing. So that often, as the scenic designer, I don't have conversations with the costume designer, lighting designer, sound designer about the work they're doing, except in formal meetings with like everybody there. And there's a pressure in those situations that doesn't allow a free flow of ideas, that we end up being presenters more often than collaborators. So we don't have that same kind of time to have conversations. So I am interested in seeing whether the industry can find ways to not always operate from this place of scarcity, where we're worried about funding and can we afford to fly everybody in, and make sure that we are not rushing the art to get to the product, because that is something that I think has really been difficult for me in a lot of ways to deal with in the industry. That conversations are rushed, they're infrequent. It's often me talking to a director by myself on the phone or on Zoom and not with the whole team in the room. And the way collaboration is meant to work is that everyone's ideas are important and valid and need to be in the room together. So the sense that we have kind of separated things out takes some of that joy out of the work that we do. And I'm hoping coming out of the pandemic times, we can prioritize that richness of having everyone in the room, that kind of crackling magic that happens when ideas are being tossed around a room and you realize that you have come upon that thing that will make the show really great. I hope that we're getting to a place where we realize, because we've spent so much time remote and virtual, that we'll find that joy and that importance again and make more space for that in our design processes.
Do you think design processes have gotten less collaborative because of like people have to work on like so many different projects in order to stay afloat financially? What do you think has been the cause of the issue that you're just talking about?
Yeah, that's a great question. I've spent a lot of time in the last few years thinking about this. And I think there are several factors, as always, in why an industry shifts. One is that we've moved away from the resident design model, that it was really common in, really up until we hit the 90s, to have a resident group of artists that were part of the theater staffing, right? So you would have a costume designer who might be on staff, a scenic designer on staff, a lighting designer on staff, a sound person on staff, and then also the support systems, right? So that's technical directors and ATDs and carpenters and painters and paint charges and stitchers and everyone that it takes to put a show together. And what has happened over time is that those resident design positions have been eliminated. And we're now in our regional theater models relying almost exclusively on freelancers to do design work in our theaters. What that means is when big decisions are being made in the theaters, there isn't always an advocate for what the designer needs in order for their work to be handled with respect. That when conversations are happening about what deadlines look like, where funding is going, what your budget might be for a production, how many staff members you might need to support this or that or the other, how many stagehands you need to move scenery, those decisions are often being made without designers having any stake in the conversation, though they have huge stakes in the outcomes of those conversations. And that model, I think, radically shifted when the resident design team was disbanded across most theaters in the United States. And as a freelancer, you come in for such short amounts of time that your ability to have any kind of effect on the company you're working for is basically absent. So I think that's a major consideration. And because that stable job as a designer doesn't really exist in many places anymore, there's a small handful of theaters that still have resident designers in the United States. What happens then is, freelancing. So freelancing is difficult. It can be very challenging, especially when you're first starting out, to string together enough work to make a living. So I think, and then once you are in a place where you have a regular stream of projects or theaters that you frequent, the demands of capitalism mean that often, as you say, you're overbooking yourself. So what happens is it's back to that idea of like we only have so many decisions that we can make in a day before we hit our cognitive overload. Like how deep are you going into the project? How widely are you going into your project? If you've got 10 designs on your table, if you're doing 15 shows a year as a scenic designer, how are you focusing really deeply on any of that work? And the answer is, we get stretched. And that means that the one thing you feel like you can't afford is those conversations that are going to lead to changes. And it may be what the show needs, and it might be what's best for the production. But ultimately, anytime I've got major revisions, I make less money per hour. So there is this kind of like, I don't know, walking on eggshells sort of situation where it can be really difficult to prioritize the needs of the show over, am I going to have dinner with my partner tonight? Am I going to be able to walk my dog this morning? And I think a lot of times we are stretched so thin as, particularly speaking to freelance designers, that I think we've just set up a really unfair situation. But for me, that starts from a place of who was there in the beginning to advocate for the needs of the design, when budgets were being chosen, when staffing was being discussed, and not having a strong advocate in the room who is not just concerned about budget can be really difficult. And I think it has led to a lot of the tension that we see now in prioritizing product over process and prioritizing deadlines over work that is really responsive to the kinds of shows we want to do. So, and we're seeing that kind of shift and change a little bit as we're looking at no 10 out of 12s, and the movement work that's been done there, just to make sure that we're finding environments where designers and theater artists can have a human life, which is necessary to do the work. Now we're in a place of trying to figure out how to grapple with power dynamics and grapple with hierarchy, from a place of less privilege and stability as a freelancer, to come back into a theater and say, this or that or whatever has to change about your theater structure. It is much more likely now that you will not be hired back than they will make systemic changes because a freelancer has told them there's problems in the system.
Yeah, it's a complex issue, and maybe this is kind of a naive view on it. And I'm a musician, so what do I know about the design world? But I mean, wouldn't it be more financially beneficial to hire, like resident designers? Because then you're not flying people in, you're not paying for hotel rooms and meals. Like, I guess it seems interesting that, yeah, why theaters rely so heavily on freelancers when, securing people with like a full time job in the end might be a little more financially viable, because then you're not spending all these resources constantly finding people and interviewing people. And I don't know. I
No,
don't
I agree with you. And
know.
there is something about, like, I designed 3 shows a year in this theater. I know what happens in this room. I know what the sight lines are. I know how the audience interacts with the stage space. I understand how we can kind of push those boundaries when we need to and have actors in what's considered the audience space and maybe audience in what's considered the actor space, and how to play with space in ways because I know that theater so intimately. And when you're coming into a space for the first time, it's all guessing, right? Like, even if you go on a site visit and you look at the theater and take a million photographs, that is different from having worked in there a whole bunch of times, which is where I think we find reluctance in theaters to hire new designers as well, is that the chances of doing work poorly is really high because it is really tough in a drawing alone to understand how space works and understand what works well for that community or works well for that theater. And it comes back to that idea that resident designers are a part of your community. They pay rent there or pay mortgages there. They drive there every day. They buy groceries with the people who buy tickets to your show. And that sense of connection to me feels really valuable and feels really important. And that's something that doesn't happen when you're a freelancer. So I'm with you. Like, let's bring them back. How do we find ways to sustainably support artists? And in my opinion, like, people deserve jobs. They deserve jobs that allow them to buy homes and have pets and, shop at the farmer's market and all of those things that folks do when they live as a part of a community.
Mhm. Mhm. Yep, I agree. Like, I guess in these conversations about things that could be different and better in our industry, do you ever get frustrated with kind of your place in the hierarchy? Like, as a musician, like, I'm kind of at the bottom. I'm at the bottom of the ladder, and so I can see all these issues, but I really have very, very little control over how to impact them. How do you feel about that? Like, seeing the
Yeah,
issues and not feeling like you're in a position to affect the change that you think needs to happen.
I think, like most folks, have danced around this my entire career. That feeling of like, well, I am replaceable. I am expendable. There are, plenty more painters. There are plenty more designers. They're turning out a new artist. How many graduate programs do we have in this country, right? Like, we're turning artists out. We are not necessarily churning out new positions for those artists to work in sustainable ways. So I think that sense of tension between how do I do the work, how do I have a sustainable career and a sustainable life, and how do I affect change, often feel in opposition to one another. And I think sometimes they are. There are theaters that I've not been hired back to, and I am like, you can never be 100% certain, but I'm like 97% certain that I wasn't hired back to a couple of them because I complained about their labor practices. I complained about their expectations for their employees. And what I've come to learn is that I would rather not work there. I'd rather not work for people who don't treat employees well. I would rather not work for places that don't believe folks deserve a shorter working day so that they can do their laundry and cook dinner for themselves and spend time with their friends and family or people that are important to them. I would rather not work there. And that means that change will be slow in those places because I think that when you push dissension away, you actually leave yourself no room to learn how to get better. So the voice of dissent, the voice of rebellion is so essential in shifting the landscape of the work that we do, but it does come at a high cost. And I 100% acknowledge that my ability to say, well, I'm just not going to work for them anymore is funded by my teaching position and the stability that my teaching position provides me. I don't need the freelance work. I miss it, but I don't need it to keep the roof over my head. I don't need it to take care of my family. So I think that we're constantly playing this balancing game between what is my voice as an advocate and an activist, and what is my need for a job. The benefit that I have of having my stable university position is that I now feel like I have the room to say to a theater, to say to a group that I'm working for, this behavior is not acceptable. And that may mean I don't get hired back, but at the end of the day, right, like I don't want to work places that are not aligned with my values. I think often we leave a lot of power on the table, and hearing, and this was a couple of years ago when there were uprisings in Central and South America, that it only takes 6% of a population sustained activism for 6 months or more to topple a dictatorship. Right? So if it only
Hmm.
takes 6% dissension to topple a dictatorship, what's it going to take to topple the power structures in the arts? It'll take sustained movement. And that's where affinity groups like La Gente, affinity groups like the Latinx Theater Commons, and so many others, right? The Black Theater Network, the Black Theater Commons, and so many that have sprung up and have had long sustained lives in the United States. That's where there's such power in these organizations and movements, because then it's not just you, right? No more 10 out of 12s is not just one person complaining about not being able to spend time with their family, which is easy to dismiss. But we're talking hundreds of people have come up in the last year and talked about how dangerous working these kinds of hours have been, that there have been, near misses or car wrecks, missed time with family members and children. And it takes a movement sometimes for people to see it's not just one person complaining, it's a systemic problem. So, in my experience, I think it's important as an individual to speak to these kinds of needs in our industry to create safe and sustainable places for arts workers. But that can be really scary to do by yourself. And that's where having your people, having a movement that are with you, then you're not just speaking for yourself. You can find some power in the folks around you that you have learned from, that you have taught, that you have spent time with, to say, like, no, these experiences are happening outside of just my experience. And that for me has been really transformative. I am not by nature an outspoken person. I am not brave in spaces, but I have learned to be braver because of my work with other activists. And I've learned what my role can be in a movement by spending time with other activists. So I think it's easy to feel powerless when you are alone. And our systems are set up to make us feel separate from one another and make us feel isolated and make us feel disempowered. But there is an easy way to work against that. And that's where unions were born. That's where, affinity movements have come from and ally movements have come from. And really, I think engaging with that work makes you a braver person. And it proves to you that if this theater is not the place for you to work, that's okay, because there are so many more theaters to work for.
What are some of the groups that you are a part of that you've really been encouraged by?
Yeah, I would say the two for me that have been really foundational have been the Latinx Theater Commons, which I've been on the steering committee of since 2017. It is a more kind of broad ranging movement to transform theater in the United States, that is really about how we support and amplify the voices of Latinx artists in the theater community. And then the newer group that has been really just like such an emotional home to me in the last year has been La Gente, the theater design network, the Latinx theater design network. And La Gente is all designers, right? So it's like my peeps. And we come from all kinds of different backgrounds and different kinds of experiences. You have everyone from students who are just graduating to folks who have worked on Broadway, regional theater, folks like me that are mid career but still kind of working in smaller, scrappier theaters. So it's just this really rich mixture of humans. And we have found such similarities in the work we do and differences in the work that we do. But the power of working in movement with other artists is that it defeats that sense of feeling alone. It defeats that sense of isolation. So yeah, big shout outs to La Gente and to the LTC.
Yeah, I've been so excited to see just more organizations, more groups, whatever you want to call them, kind of pop up throughout the pandemic, and I'm really looking forward to seeing how the effects that these have over the months and the years that are coming, because I think more people are being more aware of marginalized groups and the fact that there are really talented, really skilled people in those groups that can handle these bigger prestigious jobs. So I'm excited to see that all come into fruition.
Yeah, me too. And for some of it, in speaking towards La Gente, it was difficult in the summer of 2020 to not feel a sea change, right? After the murder of George Floyd, and the sweeping protests across the United States, that so many white folks took part in for the first time, kind of in memory. It was hard not to feel like there could be change in our country and like massive, rapid, meaningful change in our country. And that I think has to kind of spill into my hope for the arts, that I believe there can be massive transformative change in these fields that we value so much. It's difficult to hear well, we couldn't find so and so, or this person doesn't exist, like underrepresented groups are unicorns and not just folks who haven't been given opportunities. So I am really excited to see how affinity groups will shape, because I believe they will. They already have shaped the way American theater operates. I'm excited to see how that grows. I'm excited to see as we come out of the pandemic now into live performance again, uh, to see what casts look like, to see what seasons look like, and who's designing the shows, and who's running the theaters and selling tickets and working in administrative offices. Because I think it's really easy to focus on the performers and the playwrights and the directors, and to let the other things slide. So that has been something interesting to see in the last year that was not present, in my opinion, before, was a lot of look at what administrative offices look like, and who's working in those spaces, who's working in backstage, who's running our shows. Yeah, I am excited to see what new voices we discover in the next few years, and how we can do our work to better represent the demographics of our country.
Hmm. Definitely. This has been great. I like to ask everyone one final question. And my final question is, what are you excited about right now?
Yeah, I am really excited to be back in my classroom in person. I taught the whole pandemic online, and I have never felt like such a failure. And my sweet partner, bless him, spent a lot of the pandemic reminding me that I was, like building the plane as it was flying. So, of course, failures are inevitable when you have no plan and all of a sudden you are changing everything you've always done in your job. So, cool. Have a little grace for yourself. Um, but I think for anyone that spent a lot of time online, which has been most of us in the last year, it is exhausting work. We don't connect to humans the same way across a screen that we connect to humans in a room together. There is something about that sense of shared space and community that I have missed so desperately, and particularly with my students. So I'm excited to be in space with them again. I am excited to hear what their dreams and hopes are, and share mine too, right? That sense of exchange is so important, and that can be so difficult when we are virtual. So that's what's got me really jazzed right now and really excited for the next couple of months.
The music for the Backstage Creative was improvised and performed by Ian Leroy, and the logo was designed by Carly Wagner.